Telephoto photography is one of my absolute favorite ways to capture images. Whether you're into sports or wildlife, or like me, you just really like to compress landscape images with the telephoto lens, there comes a point in basically everybody's photography journey in which they realize that a telephoto lens is something that they should probably have in their kit. But the downside of these lenses is it typically costs a kidney or two to end up securing one yourself. Enter the Tamron 150-500 lens, which may just be that budget option that could help you get that extra reach you've been looking for. In this video, we're going to take a look at whether or not you should be considering this lens. Let's get into it. So before we get into it, I just want to make one thing clear. This is not going to be a review where I just rattle off a bunch of specs. If that's what you're into, there are plenty of other YouTube videos. Go watch one of those instead. Instead, I put it through its paces over multiple weeks. I took it to Yosemite to test on birds, deer, and mountains. I took many compressed portrait shots and compressed shots of the Golden Gate Bridge. I took it to the fog waves of Mount Tam. I really wanted to get a full swath of different testing done with this lens. I'll also note that I did all of my testing on the Sony Alpha 1 because I really didn't want the camera to be limiting any of the testing in any way. Let's talk about the things that I did and did not like about this lens, and then I'll wrap it up with a nice little conclusion and help you determine if you should be buying it. First things first, let's talk about price. This lens clocks in at just around $1,400 US, so you get to keep both your kidneys, which that's good. We like kidneys. Stack that up next to some of the comparable Sony lenses, such as the Sony 100-400 or the Sony 200-600, both of which are $2,500 and $2,000 respectively. So off the bat, when considering the Tamron, you're saving a nice chunk of change. With respect to the optics, I found them to be relatively sharp and the color rendering to be pretty decent. There was never really a point where I looked at an image and said, ugh, that's not very sharp, but it's certainly not quite as sharp as something like the Sony G Master. When we consider the $1,000 price difference between something like the Sony G Master, I think that price to sharpness level is more than reasonable. I would also say that the autofocus was pretty decent as well. There certainly were a few times where a bird or the deer was tucked behind a rock or some grass and it was having a little bit of trouble catching it, but I would say overall it did work very well with the bird AF, the wildlife AF, and the portrait AF that you would find on the Sony Alpha 1. That said, when compared to the Sony G Master, the G Master definitely has better autofocus performance. It practically never misses. But you get about an 80-ish% hit rate with the Tamron when in super high burst rate and doing animal tracking as it's moving. With any type of static subject, it did fairly fine. The lens also has a bunch of nice to haves, which in and of themselves would not really necessarily be a selling point of the camera, but when you take into account that this is a budget lens, there's a lot of things in here that are just really kind of nice and easy to use. When the lens is fully collapsed, you have this nice little locking mechanism that prevents the barrel of the lens from pulling out for any reason. And then on the actual zoom ring itself, when you've decided on a focal length that you want to stick with, you can slide the focus ring forward and it will lock in that exact position. This can be helpful for a ton of different scenarios. I found myself using it especially a lot during landscape scenarios where I didn't want to move the scene. Maybe I wanted to blend a long exposure with a shorter exposure. So that's a very nice option to have as well. You've also got an integrated Arca Swiss mount on the tripod foot. Why doesn't every camera and every lens have this integrated? We need to stop with adding on these little things like it's gonna be on an Arca Swiss and just put another screw plate on there for if you need to do a Manfrotto mount. This design just makes sense and I wish more camera companies would do it. While I do like some of these little design features that they've added on here, I really don't like the focus ring. A lot of people that review this lens say that, oh, the focus ring doesn't matter. Why would you use a focus ring for this? I actually end up manually focusing when I have some really distant subjects for landscapes all the time, and having this kind of cheap little plastic focusing ring is something that I didn't really enjoy, which kind of brings me to some of the cons of this lens. The first one being that you cannot make full use of the A1's full burst rate. While the A1 can shoot up to 30 frames per second, when paired with this Tamron 150-500, you can only do 15 frames per second, which up until the point where we released the A1, 15 frames a second was mind-blowing already. So maybe this shouldn't really be seen as a downgrade, but if you paid the $6,500 for the A1, and then you also want to pair it with a telephoto lens for wildlife or sports photography, this would certainly not be the area that I would think you should cut corners. The lens also has a variable aperture of 5 to 6.7. And while having a variable aperture on a lens that is kind of this compact size for being so long is totally normal, I will say the fact that we get to only 6.7 at its most extended can be a little bit bothersome at times. If you find yourself shooting in some low light scenarios, you're either gonna have a lot of camera shake or you're gonna have to crank that ISO harder than Soulja Boy. I found this to be an issue when I was taking some long shots of my friend Megan under some trees. This wasn't necessarily a super low light scenario, it was still about an hour and a half before sunset, but it was at least to the point where while I was hand holding it, there was only a couple of photos that turned out that were sharp enough and didn't have camera shake. So if you're watching this video and you are considering purchasing this lens, you probably find yourself in a few different scenarios. I think the most likely scenario is that you probably have something like the 70-200 or something equivalent, and you want something with a little bit of extra reach. This means you have a couple of options. You can do a teleconverter, you can shell out for the G Master 100-400 or 200-600, or you can go with this lens. I'll just flat out say, do not purchase the teleconverter. I wasted $500 on mine, and I've only ever had it be an unsharp, impossible to focus mess. I hate all the photos that I've ever taken with it. On a completely unrelated note, if you want to buy the Sony 2X teleconverter, drop a comment below and we can be in touch. On a more serious note, if you do have that 70-200, you want extra reach and you're a little bit more budget conscious, I think this Tamron is the perfect thing to add to your kit. However, if you do have the extra budget, I really still like the 100-400, and this is actually the only telephoto lens that I own. It does beat it in basically every performance category, it just costs $1,000 more. If you're in a scenario where you don't have a 70-200, I would probably recommend buying that first, unless you only do wildlife. I think my overall best pairings of a telephoto lens lineup would be either a 70-200 plus the Tamron, or an 85 prime with the 100-400. And I think that gives you a full range of coverage from portraits to long landscapes to wildlife, and it really would have you nice and set. I hope this made your purchasing decision a little bit easier. If you did like this video, here's a couple of other ones that are popping up, and I'll see you in the next one.